Welcome back to another video. This week, I'm not sewing for myself, I am sewing for my partner. When I got this fabric right here, my partner said that he thought this would make a very cool shirt, and so I'm gonna make it for him. If you're new here, hi, I'm Olga, and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. So this fabric is obviously the start of the show this week. It's really pretty, it's such a cool print. This is from Minerva. It's called Dantes Dreamscape. And this one here is a Viscose challis. It has like a bunch of colors in the back, and then it has like fantastical creatures printed on top in black, but like with fine line. Like it's very, very cool. I feel like it is one of those prints that you could look at for an hour and still find new things. So it's a very cool one. They also have this exact print in a linen cotton blend, which I also think would make a really cool shirt, would be very comfortable as well, but would have less drape. I got this fabric for free, but this came in a goodie bag. So when we went to the Minerva birthday party, everybody who went to the event got a goodie bag which included fabric and other things in it. This was actually in his goodie bag, and when he pulled it out, he was like, oh my god, this would make such a cool shirt. So here we are. You know, 8 months later, we're here finally doing it. Because I have such a busy print that I really want to be like shown off, I am going to be using a very simple pattern. I also asked my partner mostly what kind of neckline he wanted, because like shirts are all pretty similar, or like men's shirts are all pretty similar. And the two main patterns that I usually use for him are like a normal, collared button down like this one, or I sometimes will make him the ones that have like more like a V neck shaped collar. But he wanted this kind of collar best. He likes this pattern a lot. So I have made it for him a few times. I've made it in like flannels. I made it in like proper dress shirts, which he wore to that event actually. So I have made this a few times and he really likes it usually. So it's the first time I'm doing it with the short sleeve. So that's the option we're going with. We're going with view A. And I have not said the number, but this is Vogue 8759. I haven't even looked at buttons yet. Once the shirt is done, I'll probably have him look at the buttons and pick out a pair, like a set that he likes. And if I don't have anything that he likes, then I'll go and get him some that he might like. But yeah, I'm pretty much ready to start sewing. I have pre-washed this, so Viscose challis can shrink, it doesn't always, but it can. So it is a good idea. I know I'm rolling my eyes so hard because I hate pre-washing my fabric. It is a good idea to pre-wash, and I have pre-washed this already. So I'm gonna go ahead and clear my desk and start sewing, or like prepping to sew. Sewing is 95% prep and 5% sewing, in case you're new to it. So that's it. I've talked too much already for this intro, so let's go get started. I start by laying out my fabric with right sides together, and I started pinning the pattern pieces to the fabric. Once I've got everything pinned, I roughly cut out the pieces so I can fit them on my cutting mat. I find it much easier to cut drapey fabrics like this Viscose challis with the Rotary Cutter and pattern weights. I don't use the Rotary Cutter more often because it hurts my wrists a bit. I'm usually too lazy to get out the mat, and I'm a bit clumsy, and I find I cut myself on the blade quite often, so it's actually safer for me to just use shears. For this fabric, I just find this is worth the risk. I also cut out the notches marks on the pattern and transfer the lines on the opening edges. From my experience with this pattern, these are the only markings I need, but if it's your first time, it's totally okay to take the time to transfer all the markings if that helps you out. I use my quilting ruler and a heat erasable pen to transfer the lines, but then I go over them with stitch marking. I do this for a couple of reasons. One, in busy prints like this, it really helps make the markings visible from both sides of the fabric more clearly. And two, as soon as I press one of the folds, the other lines will disappear, and I need them, especially the center line, until the very end of the project. With all that done, I was ready to sew. I started by putting the back of the shirt together. The first step is the French seams on the back. I'm not sure why these are the only French seams of the garment, but you know what? I'm not going to question it. To sew French seam, you start with placing the fabric with wrong sides together. Here I'm pinning the side back pieces to the center back. The seam allowances I'm about to give you are for a total seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Please double check your pattern seam allowance when you try French seams to make sure it all adds up. Once you have that pinned, you sew the seams about 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters from the raw edge. Then you trim the seam allowances to reduce the bulk and press the seam open. Next, you can fold the fabric along the seam with right sides together and press that again. To encase the raw edges, you sew a second seam about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the folded edge. Then you press again. I usually press the seam towards the side backs, and that's how you do French seams. To finish putting the back together, we need to add the yokes. I like to add both yokes at once, but you can do one at a time if you find that easier. I pin the outer yoke to the back with right sides together, and then I add the facing yoke with right sides facing the wrong side of the shirt, and I pin that in, sandwiching the back. I sew that in place with the normal seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Then I trim the seam allowance to reduce bulk and press the seams. While the iron is on, I press the front opening edges all along the fold lines. There should be 2 fold lines and then the center front line. I press along the first one and then fold that over and press the second one. The center front line is a guide for the buttons later on. Once I have my 2 fronts pressed, I pin the front and back together at the side and shoulders, leaving the facing yoke free. The instructions for this shirt tell you to only do the shoulders, and then you add the sleeves, and then you close the sides of the sleeves and the bodice in one, but I prefer doing it this way. I stitch all those seams in one go, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish of each seam. Then I trim the seam allowances to reduce bulk, and I finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. You can finish your seams any way you like, but I do recommend you finish them because this fabric does fray quite easily. And of course, I press all those seams. I usually press everything towards the back. Here I also took the time to press in the seam allowance of the shoulder seam on the yoke facings. Then I pinned the folded edge over the stitching of the shoulder seam and stitch that down by hand with a slip stitch. This gives you an invisible finish, but if you don't care about that, you could just top stitch it down as well. Now we can move on and start working on the collar, but first we need to interface one of each of the pieces. One of the collar stands and one of the collar. It doesn't matter which because they're the same. I used some interfacing scraps that I had in my stash and fused it to the collar pieces with my iron. Then I pinned the collars to each other with right sides together along the 3 outer edges, leaving the edge with the double notches free. I went ahead and stitched that seam, pivoting at the corners. I trimmed the seam allowances, making sure to clip the corners too. Then I flipped the collar right side out, making sure to get my corners nice and crisp and press it in place. Now it's time to add the collar stand. First, I pinned the interfaced collar stand to the interfaced side of the collar, matching the notches. I flipped that over and pinned the uninterfaced collar stand to the uninterfaced side of the collar, again matching the notches, sandwiching the collar between the collar stands. I like to flip the seam allowance of the long edge of the collar stand facing up and pin it to make my life easier later. I stitched that in place, taking it slow around the curved edges. Then I trimmed the seam allowance, flipped the collar stands right side out, and pressed the whole thing. I like to press one side at a time to make sure I really get everything in place. I also went ahead and pressed up the seam allowances of the remaining edge of the collar stand facing. Now I can pin the collar to the shirt. I find the center of the collar stand and mark it with a pin, and I do the same for the yoke neckline. Then I match the pins to make sure my centers are perfectly aligned. Then I pin the rest of the collar out from there. I am only pinning the interfaced collar stand to the shirt with right sides together. When I get to the front opening edges, I flip them out to the inside along the first fold line and pin that in as well, sandwiching the collar stand. Sewing this can be a bit tricky, but take it slow and make sure to smooth the fabric so you don't get tucks and puckers. Once I had that sewn down, I trimmed the seam allowances, flipped the front facings back to the outside, and pressed the whole thing in place with the help of my tailor's hammer. I clipped the seam allowance at the opening facings so I can have it pressed up under the collar and pressed down under the opening facings. Then I stitched the folded edge of the collar stand facing down by hand using a slip stitch hiding the stitching line. For the sleeves, I start by adding 2 rows of easing stitches at the sleeve cap as always. Then I pin the sleeve closed with right sides together, matching the notches, and sew those in place. I trim the seam allowance, zigzag the raw edges, and press them towards the back. I also want to finish the hem of the sleeves before I sew them into the shirt, so I start by folding up the full hem allowance amount and pressing it in place with the help of my seam roll. Then I fold the raw edge in to have them encased, and press that again. I top stitch the
hem in place on both sleeves, using my finger to feel where the folded edge is on the other side of the fabric and guide it on the machine. Alright, so I usually don't ease my sleeves in because I like a dramatic shoulder detail, but here I'm going to do it and show you how. So I start by matching the underarm seam to the side seam of the shirt and pin that in place. I am putting the sleeve in with right sides together and matching the notches. Then I like to pin up to the notches, and I will tie off the easing stitches on one of the sides and pull on the other until the sleeve fits in the armhole. Now comes the annoying part of evenly distributing the fullness along the sleeve cap. This can be a bit frustrating and time consuming, but in my experience it's actually easier to do it on men's patterns than on women's. I pin the sleeve as I go, and I sometimes seems like there's surely going to be tucks, but as long as the excess fabric is on the seam allowance side of the stitching line, you're all good. Then you can stitch the sleeves in place, taking it slow and making sure you're smoothing the fabric under the machine to avoid tucks and puckers. After sewing, I like to double check it's okay, and then I trim the seam allowances and finish the raw edges before pressing the seam allowances towards the sleeves. All we have left to do now is the hem and the buttons. I like to do the hem first, so basically I do the same thing I did for the sleeves with one difference, which is the facings. So for the facings, I first flip them to the inside like I did for the collar and stitch them along the hem allowance, which for this pattern is 3.2 centimeters or 1¼ inches. Make sure to backstitch at both ends. Then I trim just the facings and a little corner off the hem. When I flip the facings back to the outside and press them, the hem wants to flip up, which is exactly what we want. Now I repeat what I did for the sleeves. I press the full hem allowance up, then fold in the raw edges and press it again. I top stitch that too, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish. Now for the buttons. First, I lay out my shirt, making sure to get the seams nice and straight and line up the center front lines I stitch marked earlier. I like to add a pin at the top and bottom, and I also added one down the middle because this fabric is too wobbly. Then I used the button guide the pattern provided to mark out the buttonholes. I used my heat erasable pen and also some pins because the pen was hard to see over the print. I make the buttonholes on my machine, including the one on the collar stand. To mark the buttons, I line the center fronts again and use the buttonholes I just made as a guide. Today, I decided to sew the buttons by hand. We went with these simple 4-hole black buttons. Usually, I would sew these on the machine, but I didn't feel like changing the threads, so I just stitched them by hand. I used doubled up black thread, and once I had them sewn in, it was time for the reveal.
It's done. It's finished. I think it looks really cool. I'm really happy with it. My partner is really happy with it. He likes it. It fits him really well, which is the main thing really because I made it for him. Came together really quickly for me. Obviously, I have made this a few times before, so I know, like, I kind of know what I'm doing. I always made it with the other sleeve. It's a little bit like more labor intensive, I guess. Short sleeve is much easier to do. Don't have that much to say about it, really. It's, yeah, it turned out good. No major like mistakes or annoyances. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave it a like and a comment and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't done that already. It would mean a lot to me. You could also follow me on Instagram or TikTok. I post on there pretty much every day. Everything is linked below, so you can go and find it super easily, as well as all of the materials and like fabrics and things, everything I use, I will link whatever I can. Some of them are affiliate links, so if you want to support the channel, that's a good way to do it. I'm looking over, like I keep thinking this is a person. That's it from me. Thank you for watching and happy sewing.